expressed in the following are those of its participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the producers and the Six Talk Podcast Network. Also, the following contains mature material and mild language, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
Writer and translator Matt Alt is a name that a good segment of English-speaking fandom would be familiar with in some form. If it isn't the name itself, chances are you've played a game he's had a hand in translating, including various Gundam games, Strider, Lost Planet 3, and Team Ninja games such as Neo, Dead or Alive, and Ninja Gaiden, and also Lunar Silver Star Story. Over the last 15 years, he has written or co-written a number of books on Japanese pop culture, including the Attack Trilogy, Hello Please, with his wife Hiroko Yoda, Super Number One Robot, and The Secret Lives of Emoji, along with a number of translations in that space. And if that's not enough, he has also been a TV presenter as well. Many will probably recognize Mr. Alt as the co-host of the NHK World program Japanology Plus over the last 5 years. His latest book, Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World, can best be described as a cultural investigation through stories, events, products, and various points in post-war history to help understand the point of the title. Matt Alt joins us from his home in Tokyo, and I know it's just after 8:45 there in the morning. Good morning to you, Mr. Alt.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well. As I said, this is a real honor to finally get a chance to talk to you. We've been in touch since August. And
yes, we've been kind of trying to make the schedules work, haven't we?
Yes, and it never totally worked out because I wanted to take some time to read your book, and then you went on various other podcasts and other online forums to help promote the book, and other talks, which were wonderful to watch, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
And I will say, and this is just as a slight joke, you are the first NHK World personality I have talked with. It is sort of on this podcast's bucket list to be able to talk to as many NHK World personalities. I think you were number 3 on my list, behind Peter Barakon and Aki Shibuya.
Oh, so. Peter, yes, Peter. Peter, who is the real the power, the driving force behind Japanology Plus. It's always a pleasure to work with him.
That's an interesting show. When I first talked about watching NHK World back a number of years ago, I pointed out 2 shows that were very similar yet very different. That it was Japanology and then Cool Japan.
Right.
And Cool Japan had this shock and awe feel to it, because it just had a habit of putting something in your face and watching the reactions of people who saw it. It felt, maybe in some ways, it felt like a typical Japanese show, at least as
sure
it's become stereotypical to many of us here in the West. But Japanology had a more BBC feel to it, and it kind of helps with Peter Barakon and Emma Howard narrating.
I see what you mean. Yeah, it definitely is a more deliberately more cerebral kind of show. And I think they actually brought me on to try to kind of balance it a little bit by injecting a little bit of, I'm more hyperactive than Peter. It's just a fact. It just is. And that's not any, I don't make any value judgment there. It's just how it is. And so, Peter will be sitting in this kind of quiet environment, for instance, talking to some expert about rescue teams and like the fire department and police departments in Japan. And then like they'll cut and they're like throwing me out of a helicopter. That's like my
to make you look a little bit silly at times.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, a lot of people are kind of mistaken in that they think that I'm like kind of forcing it, or that I'm kind of, deliberately trying to craft a character. And like when you're on camera or you're on mic or whatever, you do tend to kind of, you're not as, it's not like you're just talking with friends, of course. So there is a kind of presentation there, but I'm thrown into situations on that show that I know nothing about. It's not like, Matt, tell us about your book, or what are your interests? It's not about me. It's like it's about the kind of topic that's being covered. So if we're talking about, I don't know, bridge cleaning crews or something like that, that was one thing we did. I don't know the first thing about that, so I'm like, whoa, what? Hey, okay, I'm just kind of stumbling through it, just like the viewer would be. And so suddenly when you find yourself on top of a bridge span, hundreds of feet over the water, of course you're going to get kind of hyperactive or freaked out or something like that. So but it's cool. I mean, it's thrown me into so many, Japanology Plus threw me into so many different situations that I just, normal people don't get to experience. And I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun watching it. It is one of the go-to shows I do watch these days on NHK World.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that. It's been kind of on hiatus a little bit because of COVID-19. They haven't been able to really get out and film, and I took a kind of break from the show this year because I was anticipating, promoting my new book, Pure Invention. But then, as fate would have it, COVID-19 swept the world, and everybody got kind of locked down. So both the show went on hiatus, and I didn't go anywhere, and that's just kind of how it goes.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to bring up another name that we both admire. All three of us actually have a lot of admiration for.
Okay.
I first heard about this book through both Facebook and Twitter posts by Fred Schodt. He spent time actually pitching the book. And I recognized your name from the show. And I asked Fred, because I do talk with him every so often. I do text him since our interview at Anime North. And I'll tell you a quick aside about that. I texted him saying, you know Matt well. And he said, yes, really nice guy. And I asked him because I was considering maybe I would try and contact you and ask you to do the show sometime, because I read the subject matter of the book and I thought this could be something I could really get into. And Fred just said, he's a really nice guy. You should ask him to do your show without me even asking if it's okay to ask you.
Right.
And that's where it really started. And then I mentioned I had to figure out a way to eventually approach you. But I made it a point to buy the book. My sisters gave me a gift card to Indigo, the bookstore here in Canada, and I used that to help me pay for the book. And I had it, and got it in my hands around my birthday, actually, and then thumbed through it a little bit, and then contact you for the first time, and that's sort of how it went.
Well, I'm glad Fred convinced you. Fred is a great guy. I grew up reading his books. I remember finding manga, the world of Japanese comics, on the bookshelf in my high school library of all places, and
wow.
Just being kind of obsessed with it because I grew up during a period of time when not a lot of stuff was available on the American marketplace, North American marketplace, imported from Japan. You were just starting to get the kind of Dark Horse Studio Proteus stuff from, in form of translated manga, Marvel's Akira. But It wasn't like it is now, where you have just, you can stream anything, anytime, almost in real time with it coming out of Japan. And so, Fred's work was just like a life preserver for those of us who kind of had this idea Japanese like illustrated entertainment and Japanese pop culture was cool, but didn't really have any way, because there's no internet back then either.
Oh, you're right.
So it was a huge a boon to all of us. And
those were early exposures.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The other thing I remember you said, Matt, sorry to step in.
No.
James Austin speaking now, but I know in the book and in previous things you said your high school was one of the few in the States that you could learn Japanese.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting experience, because a lot of us now, it's so ubiquitous. People say,
Sure.
oh, I can go to JET or something like that.
Yep.
To go over and teach English or learn Japanese through different Japan Foundation courses and stuff like that across North America and the world. So it's very interesting how it's changed so much, right? Since the 80s.
Yeah.
The 90s.
I knew I was lucky, but like I didn't know how lucky I was. And it was a great experience. We had great teachers there. A lot of attention was paid to the program. So like, it was like I write about in the book, Osamu Tezuka sent like a complete collection of his manga to the school. for
Yes.
to put in the classroom. Yeah, I mean, it blew my mind. I was like, holy moly, like, you know, what's that?
It was in the epilogue, right?
Yes, it was. I wrote about that in the
correct.
epilogue of the book, and it's you know, the teacher, he wrote a long letter to my teacher, who had basically no idea what manga was. Because, you know, she had learned Japanese in the military during World War II, you know, and for her, Japanese pop culture was just something that wasn't on her. Of course, she knew about, like, you know, Akira Kurosawa and things like that, but, you know, she just wasn't on her radar. And I was like, wow, Osamu Tezuka is going to come to visit. And unfortunately, as we all know, he passed away in 1989. That was, you know, we got the box, I guess, in 1988 or so. And it was a shame. I never did get to meet him. That would have been amazing. And that would have been another connection to Fred, since Fred Schodt was his interpreter for so long.
Right.
Yeah,
And
Fred had some incredible stories. I remember he told us, Mike, about his experiences with Tezuka and many other creators, Monkey Punch and other ones. But I remember the Tezuka one that sticks out for me that he told the story of at Anime North, Mike. You probably remember it, is them being in an airport. And I'm not sure if it was in the West Coast or wherever in the States, and maybe they were supposed to go to Canada or somewhere, but they missed the flight because they got into such a discussion. And then he just
it was,
Tezuka brushed it off and said,
Oh,
"Oh, don't worry
man.
about it. We'll just get the next player signing." And
Wow.
Fred kind of felt
he felt guilty about it,
felt
but
guilty. I remember, and no one
yeah.
came up to tell them.
I interviewed Fred. I didn't end up using much of it in the book because I just ended up relying on other sources. But I actually interviewed Fred about Tezuka, and I remember just the one thing that sticks out is him saying that Tezuka was like the first and only genius that he ever felt that he had known, like somebody who actually met the definition of like a genius, like a kind of polymathic, you know, just constantly intellectually curious and supremely talented, creatively, obviously, person. And that was really interesting to hear that from somebody like Fred. And, you know, just again, I was, you know, it was cool, very cool to talk to Fred about that, but also kind of sad. I was like, man, I came so close and to meeting him.
And it was all accounts. Yeah, you
Yeah.
were thinking that too, weren't you, Mike? That what was it? Fred said that Tezuka was also using him and stuff like that, seeing what it's like on the other side in the West
Sure.
and stuff like that, and getting ideas from him, I believe. So it was
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting that back and forth, I thought.
Yeah, well, Tezuka was a very smart guy. So, like, you know, it's obvious that, yeah, and I don't think he was like using Fred in a bad way, but he was certainly you know, watching and trying to figure out, because he always wanted to appeal to the West. You know, Astro Boy, he was very, very excited and happy when Astro Boy was broadcast in the States in 1960. I believe it was 4.
I forget off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's in the book. I forget the exact year, but that was a huge source, and like it beat the Mickey Mouse Club in ratings on most of the stations it was on, and that was to him like a huge source of pride. So I'm sure he was constantly picking Fred's brain about things that would sell abroad. There's actually a really interesting story, and it came from Tezuka's own autobiography that I read as one of the sources for the book, where Stanley Kubrick sent Tezuka a mail, like a letter in the mail to Japan after he saw Astro Boy, and asked Tezuka to collaborate on doing designs for 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah,
And
that
it's just,
was a
yeah,
Yeah, I
story.
remember that. Yeah, that he
so
mentioned
mind blowing to
Trans-
imagine what that film would have looked like with Tezuka's sensibilities instead of. I mean, I love 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's an amazing film. It's actually Tezuka. As much as I love Tezuka, his style is very. It's kind goofy. Isn't the word I'd use, but it's very rounded and almost kawaii, and it's very difficult for me to reconcile what that would have looked like in like. You know, Kubrick has this kind of brutalist aesthetic. Like,
Oh yes.
you
No,
know,
I mean, with the monolith being a punchline in the last couple of weeks, with one being found in the Utah desert and then suddenly taken
right?
away.
Yes, the monoliths, exactly.
So
Yes. So yeah, so that was we were talking about my high school. Yeah, I was just very lucky to have that Japanese program, and very lucky to have access to things like Fred Schott's books and Tezuka's books. And that started my sort of lifelong fascination with things Japanese. And I'm probably one of the few people in the world who is actually using something they studied in high school in their adult life.
that's in its own quirky little way, right? In an unexpected way, to be honest.
Yes. Yes. Although, to be brutally honest, like my life as a 40 something year old is not all that different from my life as like a 14-year-old.
It makes you feel any better. I'm not much younger than you. I'm
Oh, we
pretty
see, but
sure.
this is the thing. I mean, like, look at like it's kind of the way of modern society that we hold on to the things that moved us especially as young adults. And when I was in high school, this is in the 80s, you had to hide the fact that you were reading comic books from other people. Like you would have been seen as a nerd, or like you would have been like, roughed up behind the bleachers after school or something if the jocks had found out that you were into Batman or whatever. And now it's like, the coolest thing in the world I'm sure for high school kids is to be into Iron Man or Batman or whatever it is. And adults too. And that kind of like shift in the kind of, I hesitate to call it kidification, of adult tastes, because I don't like to place, value judgments on the entertainment that people like, and for better or for worse, saying something is childish is a value judgment. But that kind of kidification of tastes, I think, is something that Japan really anticipated like a decade or two before it happened in the West. And that's part of the reason people like you and me and a lot of other people were drawn to its entertainment and pop culture in general.
I can safely say, but like my own familiarity, strangely, I would have seen Force 5 when I was younger.
Ah,
And
yes, yes.
like living in Toronto, we were one of the few markets that actually showed it.
Oh, wow.
Because it was shown in limited markets, and
We only
Toronto
had videotapes in the States. God, I'm so
we
jealous.
saw it as it was aired.
Oh,
and
man.
and we also saw a dub version of Star Blazers back
Right.
then too,
Right.
which aired here.
Yeah, we had that in the States, yeah.
And I have a vague memory of it, but I remember seeing episodes of Mito Kumon
Oh,
dubbed,
wow.
believe it or
Wow.
not. And I mentioned this to my Japanese friends, and they completely look surprised when I tell them that fact. But yeah, there was
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
multicultural station. It's now called Omni, but it used to be like a multicultural station that aired in different languages, various blocks of programming. And their Japanese programming, they actually showed Mitokumon in dubbed in one case, and then there was another case they'd show the odd NHK 15-minute drama, and this was
Oh,
subtitled.
interesting.
So
Interesting.
I think it was Oshin, but
Oh, yeah, that makes sense because that was like huge. Oshin about the little girl and is it the
I think it was. I
what
think I
year
saw.
is it set in? The Edo era? It's a period piece.
Yes, it is,
But
and
that
it,
was
it
huge. And
spans
and
her life.
and Mito
And,
Komon, of course, being the show about the shogun's
mhm.
what is he? He's like the shogun's right-hand man who kind of goes like
Dispensing
incognito.
justice.
Yes,
Yeah,
incognito into the field, and then like solves crimes and by showing the shogun's crest at the end of every episode. It's like
and
that show is
yeah.
so influential in Japan. It actually influenced at least one giant robot anime as well called Dioja,
Oh,
but which is an anime version of Mitokomon. So yeah, it's like
I did
hugely
not know about
influential.
that one.
Yeah,
But
well, it's
I mean,
amazing you got to see it. I mean, I never saw that show until I came to Japan. I mean,
okay.
it's certainly wasn't
Like,
broadcast.
I just remember like watching a couple of episodes at the time on a
Yeah,
Sunday afternoon.
yeah,
That's my and so I was like probably no more than 7 or 8 at the time.
right.
So and like that's my memories. And then things like Robotech started to come up, and I
Sure.
sort of got back into Robotech towards the end of high school, read the novels, and then but at that point I started to understand it was based off of something else. And
Hmm.
then throughout my university years I pursued that, and that's where that started the chain reaction where we are now.
No, we were putting together the pieces too. I mean, Donkey Kong and like Hello Kitty, Voltron. We all had this kind of like inkling that these came from the same sort of wellspring, but there wasn't very much information out there to help you put it together at the time,
And that's
right?
where it starts to get a little interesting. Let me go back for just 1 second here, because I have to bring this one up, and this is a thank you to you. When Fred did the interview with us, and by the way, just so you're aware of it, and some of the listeners are aware, Fred and I've known Fred since '98 myself,
Okay.
and that's when he came to visit Anime North the first time. And it was a wonder, and there's a kind of a full circle moment in all of this. We did Anime North back then. It was the second ever Anime North, and did a panel together on history. The building that Anime North took place in that year is the Michener Institute. It's a medical school building that's associated with the University Health Network in Toronto. It's the major network of hospitals in downtown Toronto. It made news 2 weeks ago today because that's where the first COVID vaccines
Ooh,
were administered. They were
wow.
administered to personal support workers in that same building,
Wow.
in the gymnasium. The gymnasium where that took place was the site of the first vendor's room for Anime
Right,
North back
right.
then.
That really
It,
is coming full circle, isn't it?
it's a full circle thing. Now, my thank you comes from page 64 in Pure Invention, because James told me, and I had to skip out on one of Fred's panels prematurely for something else. He showed a picture of Naruhito, the now emperor, but as a
Ah,
little boy with his mother, the then crown princess, Empress Michiko.
yes.
There was a picture of him as a boy playing with an Astro Boy toy.
Yes.
And I so badly wanted to see that photo because I found it really fascinating, because that took place, Anime North happened the same month that Naruhito was installed as emperor,
Ah, yeah,
May of last year.
89. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So he was already in the headlines by that point, and I would have been curious to see that photo. And he told us a story about the one time he met him.
Ooh,
So, oh yeah,
wow.
and that was because he met him for an award. But I had never seen the photo. I'd been dying to see the photo somewhere, and you had a copy of it and you put it in the book. So thank you for putting that in there.
Oh yeah, that was a great find. I mean, I had known Naruhito is probably he being born and raised when he was, he was born around 1960, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
He, or maybe in the late 50s, but I mean, he was raised in that same, Japanese kind of, rise of Japanese pop culture as any kid was in his era. And there's stories in the Japanese press of him buying like kaiju toys, from Ultraman and stuff like that, and kaiju, book. He grew up, he was a little kid during the whole Ultraman kaiju boom. So
Yes.
he's in a very real way like the first pop cultural emperor. You know what I mean? Like
And
he's somebody who you could have talked about Ultraman with.
yes, and he mentioned to Fred that he probably should give a reread of Tetsuan Atom at some point later in the future.
Well, now he's
Brad,
got
you're
plenty of
remembering
time.
now.
He's
Oh,
retired now, so he's got
No, no,
plenty
no,
of time.
that's Naruhito, and not Akihito. Akihito's the guy who's retired, right?
Right. No, you're right. Yes, actually, yes.
no.
Yes.
Naruhito's the busier one.
Yes. What am
And
I saying?
he's
Yes. I'm
really
sorry.
busy right
Yes,
now.
he's very busy now. Exactly.
And but and yeah, and he's an interesting character because of his Western education now too. Him and Masako.
Ichiko. Masako, yes.
Masako
Masako.
is his
Yes.
wife.
That's, oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay. I guess we should talk about the book for a couple minutes.
Sure. Sure.
I think it's par for the course for us, isn't it, Mike? It's like, oh boy.
Well,
No,
the book is a product of its the culture and its era and stuff. So we should give all of the actual pop culture its due too.
oh no, and yeah, and well, first of all, this was I knew pretty quickly this would be an interesting read, but what I really, really enjoyed about this book, you would put out something and then we'd veer away from it for a little bit. But you put it out there because it had relevancy. And then later on, you'd somehow be able to tie it all back. Like every chapter joins together in a various form. That's what I quickly grew to like about this book for me. I mean,
I had a great editor.
oh,
I had a great. Well, of course, I'm a great writer too. No, I'm just kidding. I actually had a really great editor who helped guide me on a lot of thinking for the structure of the book. She is, she's in her 20s and grew up. She was somebody who you didn't have to explain that Japanese pop culture was cool to. But she was American, because she grew up watching Sailor Moon and playing Pokemon. She's of that generation. So, like, it was interesting when I was pitching the book. My agent and I went to New York City and we pitched the concept of the book to interested publishers. When he got interest from about 10 different publishers, this obviously is before COVID-19 and humanity wasn't living in its basement. But I flew out to New York, and when we had a lot of meetings, and there was this, they would run this big range of ages and genders of people who we were meeting with. And, some people, like, is Japan cool? There are people who are into Japan, like, if they're a boomer, all the way down to people like who eventually ended up becoming my editor, that wasn't even on the table because it was understood that Japan was cool. And the great thing was that not only did I not have to explain to her that kind of fundamental thing, well, there's this thing called manga, he didn't have to start from zero, but she wasn't an otaku. So she wouldn't, like, there was no slack cut. There couldn't be any corners cut. I had to explain things very clearly in a way that somebody who didn't know manga would be able to understand it or make heads or tails of it. And so that was like great guidance from her. And then it also helps. I'm not a journalist. I'm more of an essayist. And when
I can see that. Yeah.
when you write essays, it's much more about, bam, you bring something up in the front, you veer off that, and just like you said, you kind of you go into different directions that are all kind of thematically connected under whatever that initial anecdote or initial story or initial opening was, and then you explore all these different threads and then tie them in a bow at the very end.
No, I like it. I like it. I mean, that's sort of the way I try to explain things myself.
Sure.
I mean, James can attest to this.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about the same thing, where it definitely has that essay feel, and it's great for those first-time readers. I'm a student of history, and I saw where you began and where you ended. But the thing I also like to look at the end of books is, for you didn't have the footnotes, you had the endnotes.
Yes,
it's always
the blind
great
notes.
to look at the endnotes. If something piques my mind or piques the curiosity, I'm going to go and look back at that. Or it's interesting to see how many of the books I've already read and stuff like that, especially since I've done reading in the Japanese video game industry and stuff like that, and even some of the manga and anime side, like stuff from Fred, for example, and other authors.
It was really important to me that every assertion I made in the book was backed up by something. And part of that was just because I wanted the book to be defensible. You know what I mean? I didn't want this to be like, well, it's just like your opinion, man. I wanted it to be like an actual work of scholarship, and in addition to being something that was entertaining to read, but also because, many of the times I would be chasing down a lead and find a book that didn't footnote its source, and it would drive me crazy. It's like, well, so where did you get this fact from? So I wanted it to be, for anybody who was reading my book, to, when they saw something that grabbed their attention, that they could flip to the back and see, oh, he's not just making this up. This actually came from a source. And that's especially true because
what type of source is that, right? Because I know you did many sources. You did in-person interviews.
Sure.
So it's always interesting to see where everything comes from and how it all comes together. As you said, not every author is as diligent with their sourcing and stuff like that, or people aren't as diligent looking, well, where did this come from? Where's the critical thinking, right?
Right. And, there have actually been complaints like, man, why is there so many notes in the back? And I'm like, well, if you feel that way, the notes are obviously not for you. Please enjoy the book, for what it is.
I hate to tell you, but most university courses, and when I was at the end of high school, they were very diligent about telling us we were going to get a 0 if we didn't have proper footnotes or proper endnotes in our essays or anything else.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Actually, and I don't understand how people don't understand that, because I've seen problems with people's before in even the university level. And it's kind of scratches your head where we've come, I guess, but maybe we're just getting old.
Or it's just the internet, like where it's kind of a lot of, sound and fury signifying nothing. You're supposed to just get your opinion or your assertion out there and just kind of let it hang. It's sort of the way of the world these days. For better or for worse, but I didn't want that to be what the book was about. So I was really, key to do that. And I also did not want to fetishize any of these individuals. Like I wanted to humanize them. So like even somebody like Osamu Tezuka, who Fred Schodt rightfully, I think, calls a genius. I wanted to portray that he's actually deeply insecure too, and like having a very difficult time adapting his style when new forms of manga in the form of gekiga and other forms of expression came out. And I don't really subscribe to the great man theory of history, which is the theory that basically one lone genius shifts the course of history. I always think it's part, people are acting as part of their historical and cultural milieu, and there's always a lot of people involved in things, and
There's always people in the back.
yes, and and not only people in the back, in the front, like, these are consumer products. So the way that, we consume manga, the way that we consume anime, or the Walkman, or the Famicom Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Game Boy, or whatever, had as much of an effect on these products as their creation in a lot of ways.
Okay.
So, and that was something I really wanted to get into. And especially in the second part of the book, the focus shifts almost entirely from creators to the consumers,
More with the various products.
But
Actually,
almost things, of course, from the actual hard products, the toys and the Walkman, that
Right.
to actually the soft power and stuff like that, and how that transitioned from almost the 80s and stuff like that, and how it's changed now to the soft power, and they're trying to
Yeah.
navigate how to use that soft power. And sometimes they haven't been exactly effective on the Japanese government side to
Sure.
exploit that, right?
Yeah, well, the whole, like, there's nothing less cool than the government telling you it's cool,
See how
So
cool
yeah.
it turned out,
and
right?
and
So yeah.
it's like your parents coming down, like, hey, check out this rock music, isn't this awesome? You're no, like, teenager is going to be like, wow, my parents have awesome taste, and it's kind of is a similar sort of thing with the government. And then added on top of that it's just this giant tax boondoggle, and nobody is really quite sure what effect all of this promotion is having. But putting that all aside, and I should state, I never use the words cool Japan even once in the book. I think the Japanese government, whenever they see the Japanese translation, which is actually in progress right now, the Japanese version of the book is coming out in the spring in Japan. They're going to be like, wait, what? You didn't mention the Cool Japan program at all? And I'm like, no, because this is way more about people, consumers, than it is about governments. It's like, you can't manage soft power. Soft power is something that happens. It's like in the video game world, it's a buff. It is a passive advantage that happens to you. It's not something that you can kind of bestow upon yourself, because it has to happen from a grassroots perspective. We think Japan is cool, not because the Japanese government spent a ton of money telling us it was cool. We thought Japan was cool because all of this random stuff that Japanese people created for themselves just so happened to appeal to us too. It wasn't even made for us. None of the stuff in Pure Invention was made for us.
No, it started with themselves as the possible consumers, right?
Which is what gives it its authenticity. It's what gives anime its authenticity and manga its authenticity. It's what gave the original Nintendo games their authenticity. We weren't being pandered to. We had to kind of discover it ourselves. And that's really key. If something is being forced down your throat, you're probably not going to find it really cool because you can't escape it. The reason that anime and so many other Japanese cultural products become not just loved abroad, but are actually become identities for people abroad is specifically because you have to hunt them down and you have to make up your own narratives around them in a lot of ways. And so when you find other people who are into these things, it's like you found your tribe in a way that just doesn't really happen with officially sanctioned things. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, that's sort of how fandom has developed in North America.
Right.
And to me, this is part of the old school subtitled versus dubbed debate.
Mm-hmm.
I think people who subscribe to watching their anime in Japanese language with subtitles are more into it and more defensive of it because they have to pay more attention to it as they're watching.
Yeah. That's actually a really good point.
It's not really passive, unless, like, if you're listening to it in your native language, it becomes more passive to you. So
I know there have been talks about that, how that has changed on the subtitles and how people translate. And I know, Matt, you've probably seen that from the 90s from Lunar Silver Star, for example, where that one was a working designs game with Vic Ireland, and he was known for making his changes and putting things in.
Yeah.
And 10 years later, Xseed came along, and that same game, Lunar Silver Star, was done by them, and they put in the more faithful translation, stuff like that. So it's definitely changed as the guideposts, and more people are like, hey, I remember this kind of from my childhood. I remember Mario, and I see, as you said in the book, it's that simplistic design, and you talked about kawaii and stuff like that, that design, the different signposts for males and females and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we come back and see it. It's like, I know that. And then you explore it in a different medium. And for me, it was video games. And then even the cartoons, as you explained in the thing, and even for some action figures. And then we come forward and we see the anime and the manga. And it's like, wait, I remember these signposts, even if they did change them and stuff like that.
Right.
Because, for example, the Nintendo games, I remember there were definitely changes made, but you can't just scrub the whole soul of a product or their
Oh no.
creation out the door. You know what I mean?
No,
Even
no,
if
and it's
you,
when I was a kid, when I was growing up on things like Anime Ego, that they were one of the first companies to release translated anime on videotape in the States.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
was a fundamentalist subtitle watcher. And I believed that they were the more authentic way of consuming anime. And like when I would see like Voltron on TV or Robotech, I'd be like, oh man, this has been like overly, changed. This isn't what I want. I want it as close to the original as possible. So I get that. But I became a translator and a localizer. It's how I make my living. I studied Japanese for many years and have a lot of experience doing this under my belt. And now I know, as somebody who actually produces the English versions of Japanese entertainment, that it's not nearly as clear cut as I once saw it, because even subtitles, you are so limited in the amount of text that you can fit in there. You are so limited. And you actually are losing a lot of nuance and flavor without even knowing it, especially if you don't speak any of the language and you're just relying 100% on the subtitles. So there's an actual argument to be made that anime and all sorts of entertainment, to really enjoy them in the way that they're meant to be enjoyed, you do have to dub them, because then you're not using this extra brain power to read subtitles and look what's going on the screen at the same time. And you have to kind of fit it to what's going on the screen. So there's no, speaking as somebody who has worked on subtitles and who has produced dubs, I can say with 100% confidence that it's not the case that subtitles are more accurate or more authentic than dubs. It really depends on how well the dub is done or how well the subs are done. So it's that's a really interesting thing. But the fact that subs and dubs have become a kind of flashpoint, I mean, they always were for like nerds, like me
Mhm.
and my friends back in the day. But now that they've become a flashpoint among, you know, more, I guess you would say, average gamers, people who aren't necessarily otaku, but are just like diehard gamers, or who just consume anime content like on the many streaming services available today. The fact it's become such a flashpoint shows how sophisticated modern consumers have become, that they're demanding this kind of extra attention be paid to the stuff. Because when we were kids, as you know, like, we didn't have any say in this. You just turn on the TV one day and all of a sudden, wait a second, Trends or Z? What is this? Robotech.
I guess, as they say, sometimes the internet helps too, because I remember the last one where a company was raked over the coals. And ironically, it was one that was a very classic series from Falcom, of course, East.
Ah,
And
yes.
I loved all the games all the way back to the Turbo Graphics, even though that
Sure,
probably
yeah.
makes me more a noob than anything else. Because remember, it went even further back, because Falcom has pedigree in the PC space for
Yes.
Japan, even though they're now more with Sony for
Right.
how they do their games now, which is kind of a funny thing in itself, where there was that PC gaming space in Japan way back
Yeah.
when, before they transformed into a more console and mobile gaming community for Japan compared to the rest of the world. But anyway, for Falcom East 8, they had brought it over NISA America, and they butchered the translation so much they actually had to go back, and thank
Right.
God you can do patches now. They retranslate the whole game, and they had to go back and redub quite a
Sure.
few parts and stuff like that, which is almost unheard of and much
Yeah, it
tougher to
is, because
watch.
it's expensive. It's extremely expensive. So, to go back and redo it a second, you're basically paying twice, you
Yeah,
know?
and
Oh,
some of
yes.
that also, the reason why people were ticked off too is both of the CEOs for in Japan of NIS and then Falcom, they were friends and stuff like that. So that's kind of how the deal of NISA got the Falcom games like Legend of Heroes and the East games. So they haven't made that mistake, I think, since East 8. They've been making sure to go over the games with a fine tooth comb for the Legend of Heroes, and I'm sure East 9, which will be coming to our shores next year, we'll be in better hands and stuff like that. But it
It's
definitely shows you need to kind of respect the material and actually go over it, and that it does take time, even though some people in the West really want it as soon as they can. And I think
sure,
about
sure. And actually, time, which equals money, time is the number one defining. If you're asking what affects the quality of a localization or a translation the most, it's time. How much time the translators are given, and also it is a money issue because there's all sorts of one of the when I first started when Hiroko and I and we run a company, as you know, called Alt Japan, which we founded in the early 2000s. When we first founded this company and when we were first working together as translators and localizers, you could count the number of full-time game localizers active in the world, JDE on two hands. I mean, there were so few of them. There's people like, Ted Woolsey and like Alex Smith, um, Jeremy Blaustein,
mhm.
uh, who did Metal Gear Solid and a bunch of other
And
games.
Thatcher, I believe, as well.
Yeah, Vic Ireland was another one, although he was more of a rewriter than he was a
Yeah, I was going
translator.
to say he's more rewriting and stuff
But
like that.
but still, there were very few, and even when we would go in and pitch our services to game companies, not there would be many companies who didn't know the word localization, and so it was a hard sell at first. Now there's like it's the stated goal of like half the kids coming out of college Japanese classes, they want to become localizers or translators of Japanese content. So the market's been flooded with talent, and as a game company, you are now tempted by these offers of like people who will be willing to work for almost nothing
Yeah, the race
versus
to the bottom, right?
or versus companies that have a lot of experience and won't do it for less than whatever this is. And unfortunately, translation and localization is still viewed as a kind of commodity in the entertainment world because, to be brutally honest, it's very difficult to. Everybody agrees that a great translation is better than a good translation, and a good translation is better than a bad translation. Like everybody agrees on this, but it's very difficult to quantify these things. And it's especially difficult to quantify what is the effect on the bottom line of a great translation versus a simply adequate one, or even an adequate one versus a bad one, because there's cases of games like, for instance, Resident Evil series, which has really wonky translation, especially in its earliest incarnations, and went on to sell millions of copies. So it's a tough space to be working in, and there's a lot of temptation for companies to go with the lowest bidder or the cheapest company, and sometimes it shows. But one thing I really want to be clear about is like localizers and localization, especially to a certain number of game and anime people, is a bad word. And it shouldn't be, because localization is not about making random willy-nilly changes to the content. Localization is about working with the stakeholders and the creators to create something that translates their vision into another language so it can be consumed there in the same way it was intended to be consumed in its home country.
I
And to
think
be
that's
honest, you have to make some changes sometimes, but you never make those changes without the creator's consent.
Mhm.
So the localizers are not the bad guys. We are just the tools of the creators to get their vision translated literally and metaphorically.
basically having people understand the context, I guess.
Yes.
That's the way I look at it.
We're cogs in a machine, and there's all. I remember when we were working on Doraemon, which is like Japan's most beloved
Oh,
manga
yes.
and anime series. Hiroko and I translated or company, I should say, translated all 15,000 pages of that manga in English and into English, and it's available on
Whoa.
the Kindle store. And now it's only as an ebook, but you can get it on the Kindle store. And at the same time that was happening, we were in conversations with not sometime very early on direct, but mainly indirect, with the anime production company in North America that was producing the animated Doraemon that went on the Disney Channel. I think it was Disney FX or something. This is before Disney Plus.
Whoa.
And when that show, because we had to kind of line up what we were going to call Doraemon's gadgets and things like that, and they made some changes to character names that we ended up keeping closer to the Japanese and the manga form for various reasons. It wasn't like that they made a bad choice; it was just they had other choices. But they were like pilloried because of all these changes that were made to the cartoon for broadcast in North America. And what a lot of the critics didn't understand was that when you're broadcasting a cartoon for kids, like Doraemon was not aimed at otaku, it was aimed at like 5 to 10-year-olds. You literally have to. There's things in the original Doraemon you literally cannot show on North American TV. You can't show anything that looks like medicine. You can't show any kind of violence. You can't show this. You can't show that. So there's that kind of localization too, where laws, like literal broadcast rules, compel you to make changes that you might not even want to. So
sort of like the cigarette, I suppose.
yeah, all sorts of things like that. Like one of the big ones was they couldn't even show Band-Aids because
Really?
they didn't want. Yeah, you don't want kids, like digging through a medicine cabinet for Band-Aids to kind of recreate whatever scene they saw on TV, and then suddenly like coming across mom's OxyContin, or whatever,
It's kind of
right?
funny because we think of that too. It's like Power Rangers. Remember the uproar with it in the early
Yeah.
90s? And then I think of too in the late 90s. It was fun for us up here. They couldn't see it in the States, but we saw the uncut Escaflowne on YTV in the
Mm-hmm.
evenings. But Fox did on their kids block every Saturday morning a cut version of Escaflowne. So it was
Right.
interesting to see the cuts they made between the two. And it was always fun looking at that because it's like, that's weird. It's like, this is interesting.
Sure. And like it's
But
very.
most people were looking at not in that way, but it was interesting when you look at them both.
Yeah, of
Okay.
course. And as a consumer, and especially as a sophisticated consumer who is somebody who's sophisticated enough to tell the difference between a cut and an uncut version of a show, which is a very high degree of sophistication for a viewer. Like that would not be the way most people watch that show. That's how diehard fans watch that show. It can be easy to get like your feathers ruffled. Like, this is so uncool. Why would they do this? And like, most people who work in the translation, localization, dubbing, anime production spaces are as into anime as you are, or as into anime or games as you are. And their hands are often tied by some invisible thing that you don't know about, but maybe it's company politics. Maybe it's, some kind of broadcast regulation. Maybe there's just some jerk at the, channel where it's being broadcast. You don't know. You don't know what it is. So whenever I see, Twitter folk getting their pitchforks out against some, poor translator or localizer, I just like, guys, like you're don't kill the messenger, man. Like the localizer and the translator is not the one who is making the final decisions on it. Any big cut or change has to be approved by the creator. And you would be like, a lot of consumers in the States would be shocked at how much creators want their stuff to be changed to sell to a mainstream, not fan, mainstream audience abroad. Like, yeah, sure, change the gender of that. Oh, sure, change it.
Or this is the title we're going to have, or these are the character names. It's like,
yeah, I mean, character names, whatever. Like, you want to call a cat a dog? Will it sell more copies? Okay, it's a dog. Like that. Most of the time, creators are simply it's a business. Anime and manga are a business. For diehard fans, including myself, when I was young, for whom anime and manga were an identity, it can be tough to accept this, but it is a business. And if something does not make money, it's considered a failure and you won't get any more of it. On the other hand, if it makes a ton of money, it will continue forever, like, say, Pokemon. Which is just as much anime as Escaflowne or Gundam or anything like that,
It's just
and it's a part of, as you said in the book, you used the word media mix, and the other one we see a lot is the production committees.
Yes.
Which it's like if you get a home run on a 2 of the 3. So, for example, you have the anime, you have the manga, you have the light novel, you have the video game, you have whatever. It's like or the figures or whatever. If you get maybe 2 of those 5, maybe you have a home run because we're all in it together, right? For the investment.
Yes. And then when all the stars align, like something, for instance, like Pokemon, like you're talking suddenly in its first year in North America, Pokemon made more than the entire video game industry globally put together. Not global, excuse me. It made more than the entire North American game industry put together, just as one game. Well, I guess it was 2, red and blue. But just because of that media mix, because everything was hitting, like all cylinders were hitting.
And originally, they didn't think anything of it. It's like, we're just going to put it on this dying system, the Game Boy, and stuff like that. And then you look where it is now. It's like, wow.
Yeah, well, it's a phenomenon. It's more than a phenomenon. It's almost like
And
culture at this
everyone
point.
said, "Oh, it's just a fad; it'll go away." Well, I think over 20 years, well, not 20 years, but over 15 years, it's more than a
Well,
fad.
the only thing that maybe became fads within Pokemon are just specific things,
Yeah,
like just
yeah.
one part of the media mix, one part of the ecosystem. But the
I,
title as a whole, the concept as a whole, it's endured.
I think the only thing in my book that I would think of as a fad is maybe the Tamagotchi. The Tamagotchi
Oh,
comes up as one point, and like that thing was huge in the late '90s, and now it's still around, but it's not anywhere near as
I
you
There's
know.
I
some
re
things, yeah, you see, like I know we've been looking at Yokai Watch, and I think that ended up being a fad because it's just died out. You've seen the
Yeah, the
sales
show did,
after
but
that. And
the
now
sh-
I wonder, we were talking about Demon Slayer, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes because I think that's kind of in this fad-like state almost in
well,
Japan.
yokai have been kind of percolating in the back of like it was like the last frontier of unexported Japanese pop culture when Hiroko and I wrote Yokai Attack, the Japanese monster survival guide back in
Mhm.
2008. Hard to
Hmm.
believe is that long
Yes.
ago.
Well,
Um,
as I said, 15. Well, I pegged your writing career as 15 years. I could be
Yeah,
wrong.
well, I get,
More or less.
I more or less, because I think Super Number One Robot came out around 2004, I think, and then Hiroko and I did the Hello Please, which is all about cute mascot characters in 2005 or six, and then
And I'm
eight.
sorry I didn't say the whole title.
No worries. And then Yokai Attack, which spawned two sequels, came out in 2008. And yokai were completely unknown then. Like
Mhm.
it was actually considered very daring to use yokai on the title, and we made a really big point in the book of not calling them demons or uh, goblins or ghosts or anything in the book because they're a different sort of concept. And now finally, I think partially thanks to the groundwork that Yokai Watch laid, I think people are going to understand Demon Slayer when it comes to the States a little bit more than they might have had Demon Slayer come out, say, in 1999. Now
Okay.
we understand there are these kind of like oni and like kind of Japanese kind of supernatural presences that are different from the ones in our mythology. And I don't know,
And they can be in everyday objects and stuff like that. And it's like
yeah,
they're
yeah,
looking at
definitely.
the
Actually,
object, you know what I mean? And that's why you said there, you couldn't even count the number of yokai there probably actually are, right?
yokai is actually the word yokai I always bring up as an example of this is what I consider the kind of highest art of localization is when not to localize a word at all. And yokai is a prime example of that because it doesn't easily map to anything in Western culture. So when you have cases like that, like sushi, like you can translate sushi as raw fish on vinegared rice, but it's kind of boring. Whoops, sorry
Oh.
about that. That's my doorbell. Or you could translate, an ancient warrior as samurai, but we call those things sushi and samurai because they correspond to very specific Japanese cultural concepts. Yokai too.
Mhm.
So that's kind of anti-localization in a good way. Sometimes not translating a word at all and just letting it kind of hang there is the way to do it, and it'll be
Well,
interesting to see if that
then
works.
then
Yeah.
then we start to understand another concept, and that adds to another language in some way, in its
Yes.
own ways. It becomes part like sushi is very much part of the English lexicon now.
Yeah, definitely. And like and bringing it back full circle to pop culture, we have absorbed so many lessons, so to speak, from Japanese pop culture, from the power-ups of video games to the to those city pop inflected soundtracks,
Mm.
to all sorts of things that now it all seems familiar and almost nostalgic to us. I've actually been really fascinated by the whole city pop boom because none of the city pop music, Maria Takeuchi's Plastic Love and all of these different city pop channels you'll see on YouTube, none of it was broadcast in the States or North America anywhere in the 80s. It was a purely Japanese phenomenon, but yet people are kind of weirdly it's like this pseudo nostalgia they have for it because all of the music in Famicom and Sega games was based on those kind of tracks. So there's a familiarity to city pop that we kind of absorb without ever actually listening to city pop music.
Wow.
And that's that kind of pseudo nostalgia is something I think you see a lot. It started with diehard fans of all sorts of Japanese pop culture, but now you're seeing it in society at large because how many of us grew up watching Power Rangers, playing Pokemon, Tamagotchi, you know what I mean? you know, all sorts of consuming Japanese fantasies that now our fantasies have come to resemble Japan's in a lot of ways, and the
Oh
way
yeah,
we consume things.
yeah. What your last line in the book? A planet of dreamers made in Japan.
Yes.
Which I thought
And
was a
then
great point
trading
to.
back and forth our cultural ideas and stuff like that. And I think back to the video games again and how 2D games and Nintendo games, and that's influenced quite a few at the beginning, indie developers and stuff like that. And I think about Shovel Knight in particular.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great example.
Those guys that I remember giving to them, and I've talked to them and stuff like that. But it was interesting, same generation and stuff like that as myself. But it's like, yes, it wouldn't run on an NES and all this other stuff, but it's what we saw in our eyes of what
Yeah.
an NES game was through a modern lens and stuff like that, and how it's still able to do it in this day and age. Because remember, with the N64, PlayStation, and Saturn era, a lot of them were saying 3D games. We had to go to 3D games. And I remember the one thing, I was a lifeguard, and it was like maybe 2000 or whatever. And someone saw me, I guess it was one of the kids saw me playing Castlevania on my Game Boy Advance. It was like one of those NES classic carts. And basically they said, what the heck is that? Like, this
Right.
doesn't look good at all.
Right.
And I'm just thinking, I don't know, I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking to myself, what are you thinking? And I thought, well, this is great. It's like, but I'm great. It's come full circle in that it can be seen as an art form for 2D
That
and stuff like that. And then the other
yeah.
thing I'm glad,
Pixel
Oh
art,
yeah,
you know.
and the
right.
It's
glad
you know,
thing
a
is,
Stardew Valley is another great example of that. I mean, that guy is hugely influenced by you know, Animal Crossing, I guess, and all sorts
Mhm.
of other Japanese content that way, you know.
but
And so
then those
we
games, I know the great thing too is now they're being transported back to Japan because for example,
yeah,
A4 I know has done Undertale and take it from the English and put it into the Japanese for Toby Fox and stuff like that. So it's great that it's now going the other way and there are
right.
other opportunities and stuff like that for
Well,
us to show them what has inspired us from them. So it keeps on going in a
yeah,
circle. I know many
definitely,
Japanese
definitely.
creators have
Right.
even been inspired by the West, of course.
And Japanese love seeing what the outside world thinks of them. I mean,
Oh well.
it's you know, especially when something Japanese hits big abroad, it's always a source of kind of fascination here as to why it's hitting abroad. And right now the big discussion that's kind of going on is Demon Slayer going to be as big of a deal in, you know, foreign markets as it was in Japan? Personally, I
Hmm.
don't think so,
I don't
but
think so either. That's the
I
thing.
just, it's a great series. I mean, it's really well done for what it is. And I think very much an evolution of that whole Jump style of kind of storytelling, but I don't think the pieces are in place to let it explode. Like it blew up here in Japan because people went to go see it in the movie theater in the middle of a pandemic, and I just I don't see
Yes.
that happening. Like if people won't go see Tenet in a movie theater, like they're certainly not going to go see Demon Slayer in a movie theater.
Well,
So
it topped. What did it? It topped Princess. Was it
yeah,
Princess Mononoke? That
no,
Oh no,
Spirited
Spirited
Away,
Away.
Spirited
it was
Away.
And they
It,
just said that I think in the last few days, right? The first
yes,
run of Spirited Away was surpassed by it, and
yes,
that's in the middle of a pandemic, and everyone's like, "This is insane." It's like, and I know the restrictions. You guys had restrictions in movie theaters as well. Some
yeah.
of them were relaxed a bit, and people were talking about that when that came out, and it's kind of crazy how this all came together.
Yeah, well, it helps. I think that Japan, there was never any real dissent to, toward, or it was never controversial to wear a mask or socially distance.
well.
There's a great comment. I think it was in I forget where I read it. It was Time magazine, I think, where where one of the experts interviewed is like, Japan's been socially distancing for 2,000 years. Like we bow, we don't touch each other, you know, and we take our shoes off when we go into houses and things like that, which is really
For, for,
funny.
further to the point is masks aren't exactly like they're somewhat. I have the impression Japanese aren't averse to wearing a mask.
No,
They're quite used to it.
not at all. I mean, people wear them. People wore them when they have colds here and things like that. That was like kind of considered common sense and etiquette. So the idea that everybody has to mask up, it's a pain in the ass. Like nobody likes doing it when they go outside is just kind of second nature here. And although
Mhm.
Japan is not out of the woods at all yet, in fact, cases are on the rise here. It's nowhere near as bad as it is in a lot of places in the United States, for example.
Well, yeah, the U.S. is one. It goes without saying, I'm
Yeah.
afraid. here in Ontario, and we constantly mention this on our show, the entire province has been put into a lockdown phase
Right.
here.
Right.
So only
Yeah.
essential businesses are allowed to stay open.
Yeah.
And
And Japan
and
never had that. There's no law in Japan that you can compel businesses to stay shut. You just can't do that here for various reasons. But it's people, you know, tended to follow official directives,
that's the
more
thing.
so than in the way. Like in America, it often seemed like people would deliberately go out of their way to defy official, guidelines and things like that. Well, I'm going to go my own way. I don't trust this, or like whatever it is. Whereas in
Mm,
Japan, there's much more of a tendency to, well, if that's what if that's what scientists say, I guess I won't go out drinking tonight or whatever.
ah,
So, yeah. So
I think
whatever the case is, I guess what I'm trying to say is not to get into a big discussion about American for
no,
COVID-19 responses or lack thereof. The
we'll come
Japan
back
had
to
more of a background where it was possible to go to movie theaters without killing yourself,
Mhm.
and I don't see that happening in the States anytime soon.
No, it's well, there's a long way to go, I'm afraid,
Yeah,
even with the vaccine out there. Okay, so you had me thinking when you talked about music for a couple seconds here. So I want to
yeah.
go through some of the music points in this. I know we're going a bunch of places. Sometimes like the book, but in a good way, I think. Yeah, the book in a good way too.
Yeah.
Um, Small little anecdote, and this is a part of the book I personally found interesting to read. Your little story about Tomomi Kahara, the singer, the mid '90s singer, and you laugh.
Yeah.
You're laughing because I think I know why.
Yeah. Well, she's a kind of notorious, but anyway, go on, please.
I see. I'll tell you the story of my own. The first time I came across her, and it wasn't necessarily her. Um, Fan subs back in the day. I got a copy of the fan subs for Rurouni Kenshin, the television
Yeah.
series,
Yeah.
and then at the very end, the fan subber decided to put a little Easter egg of sorts. They showed this musical performance.
Yeah.
It was a woman singing
Yep.
hate to tell a lie. And then
Okay.
they revealed at the end of that little snip that the woman who was singing it was Meiosu Kaze. She was doing a cover. Meiosu Kaze was the voice actress or the actress because of her Takarazuka days. She
Right.
played Kenshin at the time, and she was doing a cover of "Hate to Tell a Lie" with the Max at the time.
Okay.
At the end of the year, like when we were able to get the Kohaku that year in
Okay.
'97 at the end of '97, and then out came Tomomi Kahara with TK himself, and they performed "Hate to Tell a Lie," and then I figured out, oh, she's the original artist behind this song. And that's where I first heard about her, and
Right.
then over the years we start reading about all the things she got into. But it was just
Well,
it's
the
a
number one thing she got into was Hello Kitty.
yes, and I thought it was funny that you mentioned that part of the story.
Well,
But
you can't talk about the rise of kawaii as an identity for adult women in Japan without Tomomi Kahara, because she is the pop idol who embraced Sanrio products so thoroughly in her rise in the mid 90s that it suddenly made it cool for every girl to say that she liked Sanrio.
okay,
You know?
so there's that. What was the phrase? The rise of the schoolgirl, and then
Yeah, the Kogals. Like there's
oh
a
yes,
whole scene in it's fascinating because the tastemakers of 90s Japan and 90s Japanese cities in particular were not men or boys. It was young women and girls. They
And
were
they were on
the
pagers. That
Yeah,
was
they
the
were
funny.
exactly. They were the early adopters of technologies that helped you communicate, and things like it was girls who figured out how to jigger pagers, pocket beepers, and turn these things from just standard, they were designed to send phone numbers back and forth to be prototype texting devices. So
oh
they
yeah,
turned pagers into these like texters. Basically, you would send each other these kind of coded text. In the Japanese language, numbers can be read phonetically, and so by sending numerical messages that aren't phone numbers and reading them phonetically, you can actually send messages back and forth to one another.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I remember that concept.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
actually
and the
depicted.
precursor of emojis as well and
Yes.
stuff like that,
So,
and how
girls,
this
yeah.
developed, and then there was like almost this tech race to kind of add these elements in there
Yeah,
for these
yeah,
girls in this demographic, and then into flip phones, and then how it progressed to the smartphone, the very
yep,
first one for Apple, where they were great everywhere but Japan. They flopped because
yep.
they didn't have the emojis. They didn't have the stuff that the other guys did. And it wasn't until 2011 on their virtual keyboard, as we said, that that came about because them and Google had to standardize everything,
Yeah.
of course.
And
Right.
and don't forget selfies. Basically, Japanese women were using these things called print club machines that had initially been made so salarymen could take a picture and put it on their business card. And they started
Okay.
using them to take these wacky photos of each other. And they had all sorts of filters you could put on the photos and stuff. And then they would trade them to each other and make these Facebooks. So
This
literal books of stickers of their friends' faces and stuff.
and that
So you
became
can literally make the argument that social media was, or the roots of it at any rate, were invented on the streets of Japanese cities by Japanese women, not by Silicon Valley, which
well,
is
once
really
again,
interesting.
it's the grassroots, right?
Yes.
It's sort of the grassroots. For reference, and please pass this message along to Hiroko Yoda. I appreciated her explanation, kind of differentiating kawaii in two types. Like this, back in during the
Right.
Japan Society of Dallas Fort Worth video back
Yeah.
in.
Thank you for watching. I'll tell her that. Thank you for. She'll be very happy that you watched it.
No, I appreciate it because like the two types of kawaii in two perspectives, a female perspective, which tends to be more the hopeful more mainstream, idealized
Right.
femininity, like Hello Kitty, and then the male perspective, which is the more, let's say, skivvy one, I guess.
Right. Yeah,
So,
male gaze kawaii is how she puts it versus female gaze kawaii. And like, female gaze kawaii gives you things like, fashion, and it gives you things like, of course, Hello Kitty being kind of the ancestor of that, and all sorts of other kind of prettified, girlified, kidified sorts of kind of filter that you put on the world, where male gaze kawaii is basically sexualized. That's where lolicon, Lolita complex stuff being the kind of most notorious aspect of that, which is basically like pornography with a kawaii filter.
yeah, and that's why I said skivvy, a little
Yeah,
skivvy.
it is. No, I mean, but the presence of lolicon and I talk about this a little bit in the book, was something that kind of gave anime an edge in Japan in the 80s, like that there was always somewhere deeper you could go. It gave it and putting aside the morality of it, or whether it's healthy, or whether it's good, or whether it's bad. These are, I putting that totally aside, its existence kind of gave anime and manga culture or a depth that you didn't see in Western illustrated art. Like the deepest you could go there was like maybe to go to R. Crumb type stuff, alt comics type things. But
Yeah, well, that's
actual content that was considered dangerous even in its home country. You know what I mean? Like that's very almost Gibsonian, that this form of entertainment is so dangerous that it has to be banned, or it can damage you by looking at it.
well, you pointed out the was it the U.S. Comics Code 1954.
Yes.
I mean, just coming back because just that little bit, you reminded me of that, and how how the U.S. kind of prevented itself from going down that path, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah.
With
Well,
its
Japan had a much longer history of mature illustrated
okay.
entertainment than the West did. I mean,
Okay.
ukiyo-e, the woodblock prints, hokusai, the wave, all of these sorts
Mm-hmm.
of things, that we're familiar with now as fine art, were not produced as fine art back in the 19th century and the 18th century. They were produced as ephemera, as disposable sorts of illustrations for books and things. Disposable is going too far, but as illustrations for books to be consumed. They were mass produced. Even something like Hokusai's Wave that you would go to a museum to see today in a frame was not sold that way. It wasn't produced as fine art. It was part of a series that people would buy to see these views of Mount Fuji as entertainment. So and there was an edgy form of woodblock prints. They're called shunga, very, very sexualized.
I think
It
it
should
was
be
mentioned in
Dwight
an
in that, I
episode
think, was the
Yeah,
one.
I mean,
Midnight.
it's just they're well known. I mean, this isn't any kind of like
And
great
it was
discovery on my part.
Mhm.
It's well known that these shunga, Japanese like sexual woodblock prints, and there were some of the things that the West found really shocking when they first saw them.
And it was
Um,
interesting too, because in the 19th century with the Meiji era and stuff like that, they were trying to westernize. And some of these industries, the woodblock and that, were on the downturn. But because of the West and the
yeah.
fascination with the Japanese and Asian stuff like that, they brought them up again and stuff like
Yes.
that, which is
Well, and
kind of crazy how it all happened with.
it's also really funny to imagine that, for all of the hand wringing you see today over, oh my God, tentacle porn, hentai, like that same conversation was being had back in like Vincent van Gogh's era. Like, oh my God, like there's this beautiful Hiroshige of like some cherry blossom trees, but look, here's Hokusai doing like an octopus going down on a woman. Like this is like the one of, I think, the kind of key differences between Japanese pop culture and Western pop culture is that in Japan, the refined and the vulgar have always existed side by side.
I remember that line.
Mhm.
And it's really, really like Hokusai drawing pornographic woodblock prints did not diminish his reputation. If anything, it burnished it. And the same thing for Tezuka, who is doing these bizarre, like furry porn movies on the side. Where he's, and then no shame. I'm not judging. I don't judge, but it's, in the West, it would be very difficult to like Walt Disney doing Steamboat Willie, and then he's doing, something else with a Willie, like as a kind of as an adult project is impossible to imagine. But that was happening in Japan from the very start.
It
So
was
you
kind of
had this
interesting,
richness.
that development, thinking about, because you think of Tezuka and where he started with from this pure stuff like that, and how he railed against Gekiga, and how by the end of the 60s and stuff like that, he started getting into
Yeah.
that. Even
Well,
now,
it's
we
kind of like
have
Spinal Tap, right?
Cleopatra. Yeah,
Yes.
no, and it's funny because Cleopatra and 1001 Nights just came out in the West from
Oh
Disco.
yeah, the Blu-ray,
Like that.
yes.
So I have to actually watch them. I have them in my hand now because I'm really intrigued to watch them, because I have looked at Tezuka's work, of course, the normal stuff like Astro Boy and all that, but then also his Gekiga era stuff, and even Blackjack. So it's interesting to see the different visions he has at the different eras in that.
Well, he was very flexible. His and I think it's really telling that mainly his Gekiga stuff is what's remembered today, like Blackjack, like Phoenix. That stuff is
Mhm.
way more Gekiga influenced. And I make this point in the book. What we think of as manga today is really Gekiga. In its original incarnation, the word manga almost exclusively meant kind of Tezuka style, bubbly, Disney inflected cartoons. Whereas Gekiga had a kind of rougher hewn sort of
And
adult oriented aesthetic. And the manga that we consume that even is made for kids today, even stuff like, starting with Mazinger Z in the 70s and going up to like Jump stuff now, is very much more from the Gekiga mold than it is from the manga mold. Very much
okay.
more.
Yeah, so once again, almost repurposing of the word, sort
Yeah,
of. I
definitely.
guess.
Well, and manga has just become, manga is the kind of broad descriptor, and then you can get into. We don't really have the fine shading that you see. We're just starting to get it in the English lexicon, but Japanese have a much, much more fine tuned way of describing. Yaoi and like shonen and shoujo and like gekiga,
And so, yeah.
et cetera,
Yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. And
not
fans
really.
know them, but in the
It's not
States,
really a genre thing. It's something beyond that.
yes.
Beyond just genre.
So to answer your original question is like they had this kind of rich base of illustrated kind of know-how, and then in the post-war era they never ever had anybody putting the brakes on it like they did in the States, and with the Comics Code Authority and all of that. So and there was also in the States, I think if you were an adult reading a comic book, you were seen as a kind of a I don't know if a low life is the right word, but it wasn't seen as something that an adult would read or consume. That was kids stuff. Whereas in Japan, adults consuming illustrated entertainment was something that had been done for centuries. And so the idea that teens and then adults might read manga that featured themes appropriate to them, they weren't reading Astro Boy. They were reading Ashita no Joe. They were reading Kamui. which are thinly veiled, political screeds, so.
Coming back to the upheavals of the 60s back then.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I say this in the book, in the West, it's, the kind of 60s hippies march to the beat of protest rock and folk, whereas in Japan, that was metered out in the pages of comic books, manga.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. Less, more music there, manga there. Music here, manga there.
Music
right?
here, manga there, definitely. I mean, manga is so key to the Japanese protest scene.
And the interesting thing was they still looked up and wanted to be the salaryman and stuff like that, be a part of that group. That whereas in the West, it was counterculture and stuff like that.
Yeah, but what the interesting thing is how many similarities you see. Like when Oshii Mamoru, when he was pressed about like what their goals were for being student protesters, it was just to destroy everything, to take the system down. And I think you still see that kind of attitude today among a lot of people who are upset with society. And I also think, it might seem a little bit weird that, these protesters just wanted to become salarymen and get back into, standard society and not be counterculture for their own sake. But, I think you see that with a lot of the protests in the West. A lot of the anger in the West is not so much that people want to destroy the system as so much as they want a bigger piece of the pie for themselves, and if they had a job, if they were making a good salary, if they could afford a house, they wouldn't be out in the streets protesting. And so that's that's kind of something that there are echoes of that in the 60s counterculture, in the 60s leftist counterculture, in the 21st century far right counterculture, which is the real counterculture. It's gone from far left to far right.
And that sort of kind of ties into, the last chapter, I guess, but that's another story altogether.
Yes, the 4chan chapter.
Story.
The 4chan chapter.
Like going back to the book just for a little bit, most of the middle chapters of the book, like the subject matter didn't really surprise me. Obviously, there are certain revelations that didn't dawn upon like most readers probably. I know there were little stories there and nuggets that were kind of new to myself and James. And
right.
But the concepts themselves, the subject matter themselves, we always knew about. But the bookends were the bookend chapters. The bookend chapters. The first chapter about Tin Men, and then the final chapter, the antisocial network. Those are the two most interesting chapters to me, because that was those were completely new territories for myself, and especially that last chapter.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, a lot of people were shocked that I managed to connect tin toys to 4chan, but
you went from the physical all the way to the soft.
I don't know how much here's the thing about as much as I would love to talk about the antisocial network, that's another discussion altogether.
Yeah.
And I think I'd love to talk to you more at length about that another time.
Sure. Maybe anytime. Just to wrap it up in an elevator pitch kind of nutshell is that it's 4chan is where all of these threads of Japanese pop culture that had been kind of weaving their way through all sorts of aspects of Western society kind of merged together and turned from kind of streams into this kind of interconnected flood that was just mainstreaming Japanese pop culture, from anime to music to whatever to hentai, into the mainstream in real time, no delay, because people are just finding this stuff online in Japan and putting it up on 4chan and stuff, and how that inflected not only the internet discourse, but political discourse, because we basically live our lives on the internet now.
I know.
So yeah, that's what that last chapter is about.
Yeah, that last chapter, and I have to probably read it a couple times over, and I actually started to look up articles online. This is obviously this has been going on for years. It's just that it was lost on a lot of people. But and there had long been articles actually on it. But that was just an eye-opening thing, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, to be quite honest.
It was a shock to me too. I wasn't, when I initially pitched the book, when I initially plotted out the book, that wasn't there. And then
because that's interesting. Yeah.
The more research I did, the more I realized that you can't talk about Japanese pop culture in the 21st century without talking about the internet. And you can't really talk about the internet in the 21st century without talking about 4chan. And then 4chan is literally based on Japanese software. It's a translation of the software used for a image board called Futaba Channel in Japan. And Futaba Channel is an extension of a site called Ni Channel, 2channel, which is what mainstreamed the otaku into Japanese society via Train Man.
Yeah.
Who first appeared on 2channel. And so like, it was just really, when I started researching 2channel, I realized that everything that had happened in Japanese society vis-a-vis otaku in Japanese society through Ni Channel happened in the West with 4channel. Like, and the 4chan people who I spoke to didn't have any clue that they were literally repeating the same footsteps that the Japanese had made 10 years earlier.
Really?
They would be repeating whether it's, you know, their first like kind of these online in Japan they call it a matsuri, where you kind of invade other sites and do kind of trolling and stuff like that, to the rise of what's called the net right in Japan. 10 years later we had the alt right in the West, which, as we all know, emerged from 4chan, and all sorts of different things like that.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, this is.
Yeah, it's another topic. It's really, it's almost a book in and of itself. And there are entire books on that topic.
And it was interesting just to quickly say on the first chapter, because in some people's minds, you could have almost started with the second chapter with Tezuka, and a lot of people have started there. But I think it was great to go after the war, because people forget the place Japan was in,
yes,
where they weren't that futuristic place. They had been bombed into nothing. They had nothing. But they still had their ideas. They still had the people, and that carried them through the boom years and the bubble era, even to today. And it was that thing of going through the scraps, and then the toy car, the Jeep of Kusage and stuff like that.
Well, I just, it really, it's so telling. So telling that the first product of any kind Japan made after World War II was a toy. You know, that it wasn't like a piece of furniture. It wasn't like a piece of electronics. It was a toy. That Kosuge's Jeep is literally the first product that was manufactured after World War II. I have not been able to find any.
A few months after, really.
Yeah, it was.
It was Harper had allowed, and one of the things they allowed for export was toys, and he was allowed to do that. But it was like they had to market as from occupied Japan, and then throughout the book, some of the people like Akio Morita, they changed their name to Sony, or then we have Hello Kitty with Shintaro Tsuji, where he changed his name to Sanrio and stuff like that. So they became less Japanese, like ambiguous, so they could go around the world. So it's interesting how it all changes and stuff like that, right?
And then you have Nintendo. It's like, screw it, we're Nintendo, we're Japanese, deal with it, you know, because it's like.
Well, at that point, there was a little bit more like patience with it, I guess. If not,
times had changed, and also, you know, Nintendo knew that it had the better mousetrap, so to speak. Like, you know, its video game system was so much better than the Atari 2600 or the ColecoVision or anything like that.
As it came in, and then they became the name in video games, right?
The Donkey Kong. They became
the
800-pound
Mario,
gorilla,
right? And they test run him in Donkey Kong and stuff like that. And Hiroshi Yamauchi, he was quite a fearsome fellow. He's different from the mold. Even Akira Morita and Shintaro Tsuji, like, I look at all of them and they've been had their own books and stuff like that, and you read about them, and they're very different from the regular mold you think of for a Japanese CEO or businessman, stuff like that. They have more entrepreneurial spirit you see in the West, but maybe some of that is our reflection of our ideas in the West on them sometimes.
Yeah, well, the idea that Japan is this kind of monolithic, you know, kind of hive mind of worker bees is a Western fantasy. It's not true. There's all sorts of weirdos and iconoclasts like working here and living here, and you know, it's otherwise you wouldn't have tentacle porn. You know what I mean? It's like that's the kind of thing that doesn't come out of a society where everybody's thinking in lockstep. You know, that's some kind of crazy guy came up with this like weird, you know, his own vision. You know, and I love that. That's what I, you know, and that's what we all love about Japanese pop culture, is that it's both refined and kind of unique and weird at the same time. It's so different from our own aesthetics, weird in a great way and in a stimulating way.
Well, but then there's Crossroads coming. I mean, we on the topic of Shintaro Tsuji, I mean, we over the course of the pandemic, we heard that he has fully stepped down from
the president of Sanrio. He finally stepped down. Yes.
In favor of his grandson. This guy had some tough luck. I mean, mother
Yeah.
dies when he was young. His son died,
Yep.
I suppose, because that's why
His
his
son
son
was
died.
supposed to take over and was very much doing a great job of running. I believe he was running Sanrio America at that time, and he was in his 50s. He just collapsed of a heart attack or something. It was just complete one of those. It was one of those things. It
And
wasn't
then,
like he wasn't sick. It just happened.
yeah, and then he had to hold out long enough to be able to pass it to his grandson.
A successor, yeah, and he has grandson, because his grandson's like in his 30s now, so he must have just been a little kid when Tsuji's son died. You know,
His story is fascinating.
yes,
Like I mean, you expressed it obviously in the book, and then around the same time as we start to read it, all that begins to happen, and we hear he's finally retiring completely in full, and
yeah,
that was
he really presided over this huge chunk of Japan's pop cultural rise, and he's such a unique individual. I really it's people are shocked to hear that a guy is behind Hello Kitty.
oh yeah, and you paint a very fascinating picture of him.
And I think it's that
Some of the things he
idea of it came from his younger days of being able to celebrate his birthday, and that was not a thing in Japan, but because
Yes,
of the Git culture, he was able to bring that forward. And then how that's transformed over the decades, we've seen Japan embrace Valentine's Day, create White Day, and then over the past decade, Halloween has been embraced and all these other different Western holidays based on gift giving.
yes, and also he's just somebody who's very in touch with his inner little girl. He's unashamedly like, oh, kawaii. Like his bedroom is covered in like pink. Like there's that scene at the very end of the chapter, which I am describing from a description that comes from his vice president at the time in the 70s, who was just shocked to see that this like 50 something CEO's bedroom is like all pink and frilly and like full of like bunnies and kitties and stuff. And I think it's just a testament to live your best life. You know what I mean? Like, find what sparks joy in you, and
yeah, now,
and chase it
good
down.
popular catchphrase these days.
Exactly. And another way that a Japanese fantasy is inflecting reality all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, I wanted to. As I said, maybe we should. I just kept.
yes, I know this is going to go. We can keep talking forever and ever.
No,
Maybe
no,
that's a
I'm
good
not
point to
looking cut
stop.
off. I'm not looking to cut off at all. It's just like I want to acknowledge little bits and pieces from the book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you reading, and I appreciate you having me on. This has been really awesome.
No, this is, as I said, this is a real honor. This is a real honor for us. Sony. I want to touch on Sony because boy, have they made news on many different fronts
Sure.
in the last number of months. Obviously, the PlayStation is their thing. Here they they basically took over the anime North American anime industry
Sure.
by buying Crunchyroll a couple weeks ago, and which surprised absolutely nobody.
Right.
Words came, and then because we kind of got a sense that this was like their strategy would start to center on their anime operations. They have Funimation, they have Aniplex. Not many really knew about the Aniplex side until like. But going back to Kenshin for a second, I didn't know Sony had an animation studio until I saw Kenshin.
Right.
That's the thing, and not many would always. I mean,
I think
know now.
Sony is just a good example of a company that has transitioned from hard to soft. You know what I mean? Like they and of course they're still making hardware today, like the PlayStation 5. Though that being said, the PlayStation 5 was designed in America, by Silicon Valley engineers. It wasn't made in Japan. So like it's a Japanese game console with American DNA in it. And I think that's kind of that's kind of a roadmap for what we're going to be seeing a lot of in the future. Just like how you see not Crunchyroll, but you do see Crunchyroll, but also Netflix, an American company underwriting Japanese animation. So these lines between what's Japanese and what's not, or who's the fan, who's the domestic fan, and who's the foreign fan, they're all being blurred.
Mm-hmm.
And
there isn't otaku anymore. Everybody's an otaku.
Yeah, well, when grown men and women are going to see Avengers movies and like squealing over Baby Yoda, you know what I mean? Like it's very difficult to argue that against the idea that we're all otaku now. We are, even people who don't identify as otaku. They have that kind of DNA in their fantasy lives now. And yeah.
So, give me I want to play just pick your brain for a second. Then on just coming back to Sony, you said in the epilogue of the book, Sony had all these pieces to be able to make it work, but somehow they missed being the leaders in the smartphone revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And like it had me wondering, how did it get that way?
Well, I mean,
And
it
I
was
have
great.
my thoughts.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
My bounce was well, over the past couple decades, just as you just alluded to, they moved away from the hardware into more soft power, so into the more content stuff. But I think you made me think about the story of Game Boy of the Game Boy too, and this is like a bunch of random thoughts, but maybe they'll all come together in some form.
Sure.
Like Game Boy's success was not necessarily because it was technologically advanced; it was because it was simple enough and easy for anybody to pick up, and portable, and that's how Nintendo became a thing in terms of portable gaming. Nintendo for its part never really, like, especially these days and in the portable sphere, they didn't have always have the most technologically advanced items, but
Oh,
they always
no,
had a
no, no,
quirkiness. They
no.
always had a quirkiness that appealed.
Oh,
Maybe
Yes.
to that kawaii sense, but and that's what made it so successful over 30
Yes.
years in the portable, and probably, and now it's has its own space with the Switch right now. Contrast this to where Sony tried with their portable stuff. They tried to have the most advanced thing with the PSP and the Vita, and I know it was criticized because it lacked quirk. It tried to be a complete carbon copy of its console systems,
Yeah.
and maybe that's what people weren't looking for at the time.
No.
Now, put that all together, and I'm sorry,
No. No.
I'm
No.
sorry if I'm
No.
getting a bit on a tangent. I just want to see what you think of this. Put that all together, and then contrast this with Apple. Now, constant criticism of the iPhone is it's not the most technologically advanced. It doesn't have the latest features that the latest
Right.
Android would have. But that wasn't always the point. And Apple always liked to say, we pride ourselves with the optimization with features with our software into the hardware. So that optimization just leads to something, an interface that just tends to be so buttery smooth. And if Sony was trying to accomplish the same thing, I'm not totally sure they would have tried to go with that concept. They would just be always trying to get the most technologically advanced, but it would always be problematic. And the experience with their portable PlayStation systems, like the PSP, like the Vita, may have given them pause for thought.
Well, the Walkman was not a technologically advanced object. It was only the Walkman succeeded because it was easy to use and it answered a need that we didn't know we had.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that the Walkman and the Game Boy and the iPhone came about in their forms that they did is because there was a person who had vision running the company and who had a idea that they wanted to make something that was more than a product, but also part of a lifestyle. And I think when you don't have that vision, it's very easy to get bogged down in specifications. Oh wow, this is the most cutting edge thing ever. But the average person doesn't really care about the specifications of a processor. They don't care about the audio specs. They don't care about X, Y, and Z. They just, is it easy to use? Does it make my life more fun?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, right? And if the answer to that question is, oh, it's the most high tech thing in the world, but no, it doesn't make my life interesting or more fun, then it's not going to succeed. It's not going to succeed in a mainstream way, in the way that like a Game Boy or a Walkman or an iPhone did. And I think you're right, actually, that like there was no. Sony is also a huge company. It was much. There's a lot of different departments and people competing and internal politics, and especially after Akio Morita died in after he retired, I should say.
And I'm glad you told his story because I draw parallels between Akio Morita, and Steve Jobs,
Oh
and
yeah.
then I got the other gentleman in that equation off the top of my head, but the other half of Sony, and
Oh,
then
Ibuka. Yeah, yeah.
basically Sony had its own version of Woz as well.
Yeah, no, it totally did. And, so did Honda. Honda, Honda is named after Soichiro Honda, but he was the engineer guy. He wasn't the guy who made Honda into a global presence. That was the actual president of Honda who kind of stayed behind the scenes and let Soichiro Honda be the kind of engineering face of the company. So that kind of thing where you have the idea guy or gal and the CEO guy or gal is a kind of winning combination in a lot of places. But once those people retire, it's very difficult. You're kind of coasting because you lose the vision in a lot of ways, which
And
is
that's
why
what
I
happened.
think. Yeah, I mean, Apple I think, has arguably been coasting. I mean, I haven't seen any need to get a new iPad or a new when my iPhone wears out, I get a new one. But when a new one comes out every year with new specs, I'm not like, oh my god, wow, like this one plays in 8K instead of 4K. Like I don't
That's
I
why I
don't
go. That's
care.
why I get mine every
Still
4 or
works,
5
right? Why not keep it?
We haven't seen a company come out with anything as life changing as the iPhone or the Game Boy or the Walkman recently. We've seen a lot of, part of that's because global human culture has been put on pause for the last year, but
Yeah, that's about right.
but it's also because we're more transitioning into this virtual space. Like humanity is increasingly interacting on a virtual space, and Japan was really ahead of the curve in the virtualization of human satisfying human desires, all sorts of desires, not just our wants, but also needs, like sexualized anime and things like that.
Oh boy, yes.
So like Japan's been ahead of the curve, and that's why we just continually respond to the things it makes because of that being a few clicks ahead of us on the timeline,
Well, yeah,
demographically and societally.
it's seen something that we're going to see here in a couple decades, like the aging
Yeah,
populations, I suppose. And I know you and Fred a couple weeks ago talked about robots as well,
yes,
And he
and
showed the one photo and stuff like that, the greeting robot. And it's interesting that technological thing where technology is taking the lead, but that isn't always the case, as we've seen with the pandemic with Japan, because a lot of us were working from home. We got the technology in that, but in Japan, they're now playing catch up. It's interesting to see how
yeah.
they're going to adapt to this new world, especially the older managers where they expect people in their seats.
Well, that's one for another podcast. That's for sure. What's
yeah,
going to
That's
happen
for
in the
sure.
no
future?
doubt about it. I'm glad you mentioned. Like, I didn't know about the Silicon Valley development of PS5
Yeah,
because I remember we in the epilogue you mentioned about Xbox cracking the code in terms of Japanese dominance, and now
sure.
it's very much a player. So I'm just glad you mentioned that, but it also says a little bit about where Sony really is these days. And you mentioned about the internal politics of Sony, and and there's a big part of me wondering how that'll eventually play into all their anime acquisitions now, because about you hear about Funimation and they operate one way, and then Aniplex they operate another way, and then now you put Crunchyroll now into the fold and see where that eventually starts to go. So
Yeah,
Sony's just one of those.
no,
It's just
we're in a completely new phase, like that I could never have imagined when I was a kid, when you would just get Robotech on TV or like Star Blazers or whatever. Now you have all these big players in the space that are funneling huge amounts of money into producing content that's intended to be consumed all over the world, not just in Japan. And I think that there's been some kind of discussion online that maybe like Netflix is taking the Japaneseness out of anime. I don't think that's going to happen. I
no,
really don't
it
think it's
does.
going to happen. It's You see things like a Gretsuko being like huge hits in the West. The Sanrio character about the red panda, who's an
You mentioned.
office lady dealing with Japanese office lady politics. How did this show become a hit abroad? I don't get it. It's
Maybe
cute. It's
they're
awesome. It's just very
and
Japanese.
Seen
people,
some of their
people
next
relate.
ones that they were talking about. Firme Romai, which is going to
Yeah,
be an interesting one you wouldn't expect from them, or that they're working to bring out House Husband, Way of the House Husband, out
makes
from
sense.
there as well, which will be interesting to see how that plays out. But even some of the creators like Be the Beginning, and then some of the other ones, a lot of the creators said they gave them carte blanche and said, well, do what you want. And some of them are now thinking of different things. It's like, well, what would that international audience want, and not just what their home market wants, which they never always thought about. So it's
Right.
interesting how this all plays together, right?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes, because we're totally in a new mode right now, you know?
Yeah. And as I said, and for better or worse, we'll just see how all this begins to shake down.
Well, we'll check back in 20 years from now when I write Pure Invention 2, and and we can have the follow-up conversation then, huh?
Oh, well, I'd like to think we can follow up a little sooner.
Anytime. No, seriously, I had a great time. Feel free to call me in.
I would love to talk with you about like maybe after the inauguration, and as we learn to make more sense out of 2chan and 4chan.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
I'd love to continue having that conversation.
Anytime. Yeah, I'd love to keep going now, but it's been 2 hours. I think we better.
We're almost 2 hours. Like it's an hour 40. I think
an hour and 40. I think we should probably save it for another
for a while. But I know we all have other things to do,
like watch more anime.
Oh well, you know what my watch is right now. My current 2 watches on Netflix right now.
Okay.
And this is, and now I'm talking as the consumer, because my Crunchyroll subscription actually renewed just before Christmas, and I didn't realize it happened. And I haven't watched it as much. But my two present Netflix watches. One is Shinya Shokudo, the original seasons of Midnight Diner.
Midnight Diner. Yeah.
And I think, somebody in your in responding to your on Twitter said, maybe the algorithm does work because Netflix decided to pick up the original 3 seasons of it after producing the last 2 themselves.
Okay, I will just say this real quick because I do have to run, but I just did a panel discussion in Japanese, so unfortunately it's not available in English, with the head of non-anime programming for Netflix Japan.
Okay.
A guy named Taro Goto, and he and I did a talk for the Japan Foundation here in Tokyo. And it was very obvious from, just our conversation on stage and just what I heard there, that they're making things, they're not trying to dumb things down for the West. They're actually doubling down, if anything, on that. If something is a hit in Japan for Japanese audiences, it will probably hit abroad, which is where you get things like this new Alice show. Which is like unabashedly Japanese, set in Tokyo, set in this kind of urban environment with young people, like, in this kind of Gantz style battle unfolding, at least as far as I can tell. I haven't seen it yet. So I don't think
my cousin's into that show, by the way.
It's I can totally see it taking off abroad. And now we're in a new world where the Japaneseness of something is not necessarily holding it back. In fact, it might be a sales point. So, yeah.
Other for me, and my other show right now is, James mentioned it to me, recommended it. It's Great Pretender, but that's another story altogether. I get the feeling I'll start belting out Freddie Mercury a bit later on.
I've been liking a lot of the Netflix produced anime show. We like Japan Sinks 2020. I loved Devilman Crybaby. There's lots of great stuff on there. So,
as a fan of the Ocean's 11 series of movies, Great Pretender was a no-brainer for me.
Oh, got it.
It has the same smart dialogue in many ways. Okay,
excellent.
I guess we're gonna finish.
Yes, we keep trying to finish, don't we?
We can go forever, but maybe we should cut it for now because, as I said, the next part would be another conversation, and maybe we'll catch up at another.
Well, I leave it to you. Let's just keep the conversation going behind the scenes.
We can always keep the conversation going, and hopefully, I'll put up this photo. I'll put up the photo of you and Peter Barracon, because, as I said, that was a really cool photo to have seen.
Oh, great! Well, by all means.
And
by all means.
As I said, a real pleasure. A real pleasure.
Well, it was a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Let's stay in touch.
We will. But one last thing. Where can we find you online? Just quickly before we go.
That's tonight. A smart thing, isn't it? Huh? I'm supposed to be promoting. Look at this. How authentic is this? I forgot to even promote my book. So yeah, you can.
Once again, Matt Alt is the author of Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World in fine bookstores everywhere.
Yes. Where do we? You can find me.
Okay.
I'm on Twitter, Matt_alt. I'm on Instagram, alt. I'm on Facebook. I'm everywhere you are. Just look for me. I'm at mattalt.com. Find me. Talk to me. I love interacting with readers and fans and freaks and furries of all stripes.
And I guess we'll put we'll put the contact information for this show here. So animeroundtable@gmail.com is our email address, and we're on Twitter and Instagram at animeroundtable, and animeroundtable.com for full show notes and past episodes. Now I can seriously say, Matt Alt, this was a real pleasure. And that's all we got for this episode. Oops.
No, go
that's
on.
all we got. Oh, sorry, Matt.
We'll end some point. Let's just keep it going. I'm loving this. No, I'm just. I'll let you finish it out. You finish it.
That's all we got for this episode. Thanks for listening.